Gena Rowlands died on August 14, 2024, in Indian Wells, California, at the age of 94. Her death closed the curtain on one of the most emotionally raw and fiercely independent careers in American cinema. To the world, she was the woman who could unravel on screen without ever losing control. The actress who turned mental collapse into high art and shattered every mold of what female performances were supposed to be. Her collaborations with director and husband John Cassavetes redefined acting itself, forging characters that bled, broke, and fought their way through love, madness, and everything in between. But away from the lens, the legacy she built was just as intimate and enduring. Three children, each touched by the same creative fire. A son, Nick Cassavetes, who followed her into directing and gave her one of her final iconic roles in The Notebook. Two daughters, Alexandra and Zoe, both stepping into the shadows of their parents' brilliance. What kind of childhood unfolds under the gaze of a mother who lived every emotion as if it were life or death, and a father who made art out of pain? Below is the story of those as children. Third, Zoe Cassavetes, the youngest of Gina Rollins' three children, and perhaps the furthest from the spotlight, even while standing closest to her mother in the final years. Born in 1970, Zoe arrived just as Gina's career was peaking, and John Cassavetes, her father, was already beginning to fade with illness. In one of the last family photos where all five members are present, Zoe is the only one looking straight into the camera, unsmiling. As a child, she never asked why her mother cried so often. She just sat beside her, quiet, holding her hand. By the time she reached her teens, Zoe had become even more withdrawn than her sister Xan. When her father died in 1980, she was 19. At the funeral, she didn't give a eulogy. She simply slipped a letter into his coat pocket. The final line read, "I won't replace you, but I'll live." Gina later wrote Zoe a private note that said, "You don't have to carry anyone's flame. Just keep your own room lit." And that's what Zoe did. She didn't jump into film right away. Instead, she explored television, dipped into fashion, tried out a different pace. Years later, she returned with Broken English, a quiet, understated film about lost women in a noisy world. Unlike her mother's searing emotional epics, Zoe's storytelling was soft-spoken, modern, even gentle. But beneath the subtlety, the wounds were inherited. You could still see the torn heart, just stitched up differently. In 2010, Zoe publicly stepped away from the industry after battling depression. A photo she posted not long after showed her sitting on a balcony in Paris, barefoot, turned away from the camera. The caption simply read, "I thought I was free. I was just tired." These days, Zoe lives between New York and Paris. She directs short films, curates art installations, and stays far from public life. She never married, has no children, and keeps her circle small. But when her mother's memory began to slip away, Zoe was the one who stayed. She read lines aloud each evening, brewed tea, and waited. Not for Gina to remember everything, but for something to feel familiar. When Gena Rowlands passed away in July 2024, it was Zoe who confirmed the news to the press. She said nothing more. The next day, her page showed only a photo. An empty room, soft light pouring through white curtains, casting a beam onto a worn wooden table. The caption read, "I kept the light on, Mom. No tribute, no spotlight, just presence, just memory." And maybe that's how love endures in a family built on film, quietly, completely, and without needing to explain itself. Second, Xan Cassavetes, the middle child of Gena Rowlands and John Cassavetes, and the quietest presence in a household built on raw emotion, artistic rebellion, and cinematic chaos. Born in 1965, Xan entered the world during the heart of the family's most volatile yet inspired period. At the time, Gina was moving between film sets and television sound stages, while John was obsessively editing Husbands, often working through the night, blaring jazz records, and arguing with the screen. In that whirlwind, Xan became the one who never needed to shout to be noticed. She absorbed rather than acted, studied rather than spoke. According to Gina's journal from that year, Xan doesn't cry when she's hungry. She just waits. She already knows we're trying. Her crib was placed beside the editing equipment. She fell asleep to the sound of rewinding reels and lived among pages stained with red ink and cigarette ash. Her earliest lullabies weren't songs, but mumbled line reads and the click of a moviola. As she grew, Xan remained the most elusive of the three siblings. While Nick was defiant and Zoe sought distance, Xan observed, she wandered the sets of Opening Night and Gloria, not as a starstruck child, but as a quiet archivist. There's a photo from 1980, Xan, 15, sitting on a folding chair just outside the camera frame during Gloria, holding a book on French cinema, watching her mother cry on cue. When asked in an interview what it was like growing up around so much intensity, she replied, "You learn early that performance isn't just for film. Sometimes it's how people survive dinner." At 16, Gina gifted her a small 8mm camera. Along with it came a single line, "Don't film what's pretty, film what hurts when it's quiet." That became Xan's compass. Unlike her brother who chased mainstream narrative or her sister who recoiled from it, Xan walked straight into the weird. Her early 2000s documentary Z Channel, A Magnificent Obsession, was more than a tribute to an obscure cable network. It was a requiem for a lost generation of film lovers, told with the pacing of someone who had always watched from the edges. It was personal, obsessive, and brimming with reverence. Critics called it a masterpiece of cinephile mourning. She followed it with Kiss of the Damned in 2012, a sultry, vampire art film that leaned into gothic excess, sensual rhythm, and unapologetic mood. No studio notes, no compromise. When asked why she made it, she shrugged and said, "Because no one told me not to." But even in her defiance, Xan hit walls. In 2008, she was abruptly cut from a larger studio project mid-development. The feedback was surgical and brutal. Too strange, too personal, too niche. That night, she posted a single photo, her script covered in slashes of red ink, next to a coffee mug that read, "Make art anyway." The caption said it all, no room for weird. It marked a turning point. She stopped chasing approval and returned to the shadows. She began teaching small screenwriting workshops in Los Angeles, mentoring young women, trying to find their own rhythm in a business that still demanded perfection in high heels. Her life today is deliberately off-grid. Xan lives in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, in a house filled with old film posters and blackout curtains. She is not married and has no children, a decision she's never explained because no one really asked. She never re-entered the Hollywood system, and yet she never left cinema. She screens rare films in her backyard, sometimes to a crowd of 5, sometimes to no one. "Art doesn't care if you clap," she once said. "It just asks if you meant it." When Gina's health began declining, it was Zoe who moved in close. But Xan was always present in the margins, recording memories, digitizing old reels, archiving family letters. She didn't want to be the heir. She wanted to be the witness. When her mother passed away in July 2024, Xan didn't make a public statement. A few days later, she posted a short video, handheld, blurry, quiet. It showed Gina in profile, watching herself on screen in Gloria. Her eyes welled, then blinked, then softened. The video ends with Gina looking at the screen, whispering something you can't quite hear. The caption read, "She watched herself. I watched her." She may never win Oscars or direct a box office hit, but Xan Cassavetes is the ghost thread in the family tapestry. She's the one who caught what slipped through the cracks, the one who understood that legacies aren't always about who's remembered loudest, but about who remembered when no one was watching. And she remembered everything. "I don't make films for audiences, I make them so I don't forget who I am." First, Nick Cassavetes. Born in 1959, Nick entered a world already vibrating with creative tension. His mother, Gena Rowlands, was rising fast in television, while his father, John Cassavetes, was fighting to carve out space in the chaos of independent filmmaking. Their apartment in New York wasn't just a home, it was a makeshift soundstage. Pages of dialogue taped to the fridge, typewriters clacking through the night, arguments that might be rehearsals, or might not. Nick learned early to tell the difference between silence and performance. Gina later recalled him falling asleep under the piano during script readings. As other kids played in parks, Nick sat on folded chairs watching grips set lights. He didn't grow up beside cinema, he grew up inside it. And though no one said it out loud, there was an unspoken understanding. This child was born not just into a family, but into a legacy already writing its next scene. In 1974, at just 15 years old, Nick Cassavetes stood silently behind the camera while his mother, Gena Rowlands, transformed into Mabel Longheady in a woman under the influence. The set was a modest house, the lighting simple, but what Nick witnessed wasn't acting. It was his mother unraveling. Not in breakdown, but in precision. Each gesture, each stammer, each flicker of her eyes was something he had seen before, at home, at the dinner table, in the quiet after long shooting days. And suddenly the wall he had built between her work and his childhood cracked. Adolescence had been turbulent. Growing up in the Cassavetes household during the late 1960s and early 70s meant living in an emotional war room disguised as a family home. John was often pacing with a cigarette, shouting about structure or ripping apart a scene that lied. Gina was balancing motherhood and gut-wrenching performances that left her physically depleted. And Nick, the eldest, was trying to find stillness in a place built on volatility. He once wrote, "Other kids learn to ride bikes. I learned when a line wasn't honest. There was resentment." Nick struggled with the way filmmaking swallowed his parents, especially his father. In unsent letters, he admitted feeling abandoned by John's obsession with characters more than his own children. He confessed to hating the films, not because they were bad, but because they made his mother cry and his father forget to come home. Basketball became his escape, earning him a scholarship to Syracuse University. For a while, it seemed he might sidestep the family trade. But stories have gravity, and Nick's orbit always pulled him back to film. Even in college, he carried scripts in his gym bag, watched his mother's movies late at night in dorm rooms, studying her timing, her stillness, her fire. When he returned to Los Angeles and dipped into acting, it wasn't with ambition, it was with familiarity. He knew how a set moved, how a performance cracked open a person, how film wasn't just career, it was family language. By the end of the 1970s, Nick was already being recognized not as himself, but as Gina's son or Cassavetes' kid. It stung. He hadn't earned that yet. But part of him knew that to carry the name meant you didn't start at zero. You started under scrutiny. Still, something had changed since that day on set in '74. He no longer feared becoming part of their world. He feared not doing it justice. By the early 1990s, Nick Cassavetes had traded basketball shoes for film scripts. He'd tried resisting the pull of cinema, briefly carving out space in acting with roles in modest projects like Face Off and Life. But it wasn't enough. Acting felt like entering someone else's house. Nick wanted to build his own. His directorial debut, Unhook the Stars, 1996, was both a tribute and a test. It starred Gena Rowlands in a quiet, restrained role, a departure from the emotional firestorm she was known for. The film received warm praise, but the real breakthrough came with John Q in 2002, a taut drama about a desperate father. It showed Nick could do what few children of legends managed, craft stories that stood without leaning on the family name. He wasn't just channeling his parents, he was confronting the systems they had always resisted. Then came The Notebook in 2004, and everything changed. Adapted from Nicholas Sparks's novel, it had all the makings of a mainstream romantic drama. But Nick shaped it into something deeper. He cast his mother, Gina, to play the older version of Allie Hamilton, a woman losing her memories. The decision was personal. Gina was not yet sick, but Nick knew the fragility of memory ran deep in their family. Directing her in those scenes, watching her eyes search for names, for context, for time, was like rehearsing a loss he couldn't yet name. He said in an interview, "She didn't play a woman with dementia. She played someone remembering how to love through the fog." The film became a cultural phenomenon, but for Nick, its value wasn't in box office numbers. It was in the stillness between shots. The chance to work with his mother not as a son-in-law, but as a director with vision. In many ways, The Notebook was a full-circle moment, Nick reintroducing Gina to a new generation, not as an echo of Cassavetes-style cinema, but as timeless power. Afterward, Nick continued directing, with films like Alpha Dog and My Sister's Keeper. His style was different from his father's. Cleaner, more structured, emotionally direct. But the Cassavetes core remained. Characters in crisis, navigating moral chaos, cracking under the weight of love or regret. He never chased prestige. He chased truth. In every project, you could feel the residue of a childhood where nothing was off limits, and every tear might become material. By his 40s, Nick had become more than a son or a shadow. He had become a bridge between the raw chaos of 1970s indie filmmaking and a new era of emotional realism. Not better than his parents, not louder, but distinct. A filmmaker who, despite years of resistance, had not only inherited the Cassavetes legacy, but made it his own. In 2013, just as his directing career was riding high, Nick Cassavetes faced a deeply personal unraveling. A bitter custody battle with his ex-wife over their daughter exploded into the public eye. Accusations of steroid use, emotional volatility, and absentee parenting circulated across tabloids, dragging his name through a spotlight he never wanted. Courtroom photos showed him looking hollowed out, wrinkled shirt, tired eyes, gripping custody papers like a man holding fragments of something more than legal rights. The man who once directed stories about broken families was now living one under scrutiny. In an unfiltered interview that year, he admitted, "People think if you make movies about pain, you've learned how to process it. But sometimes you're just better at hiding it." For the first time, Nick wasn't crafting a narrative. He was trapped inside one, messy and unedited. It didn't ruin him, but it cracked something open. From then on, his work slowed. He stepped back from the machine. Not defeated, but changed. Today, Nick Cassavetes lives quietly in Los Angeles, far from the red carpets and panels his last name could still unlock. He directs selectively, acts occasionally, and keeps his personal life guarded. His marriage to actress Heather Walquist ended in divorce, and his relationship with his daughter remains private. Fragile, perhaps, but still there. He doesn't seek the spotlight, and when he speaks about his family, it's with reverence cut by realism. When Gena Rowlands passed away in July 2024, Nick made no immediate statement. A week later, he posted a photo from the set of The Notebook. Gina in costume, gazing past the lens, and Nick beside her, headphones slung around his neck, watching her not as a son, but as a director. The caption read, "My leading lady, always." No film credit could say more. In the end, Nick didn't escape the Cassavetes legacy. He carried it through crisis, through conflict, and ultimately, through clarity. But Gena Rowlands' story is only one thread in a deeper, quieter world, where greatness is born from emotional fire and families orbit around legacies too large to escape. Behind her iconic roles were three children shaped by the same brilliance that consumed her on screen. A son who directed her final masterpiece but lived in the shadows of both parents. A daughter who turned her pain into art but never stepped into the spotlight. And another who built an identity from the silences left in her mother's wake. This isn't just a tale of fame, it's a portrait of inheritance, where every triumph leaves a scar and every name carries more than applause. In the episodes ahead, we'll open more doors behind the curtain to meet the children of legends, those who grew up beside genius, but far from light. If you don't want to miss what comes next, subscribe to Legacy Uncovered and join us as we reveal more untold lives behind the legends. Thank you for listening.